Delighted to say, and honoured in fact, to be joined by a political big beast, for want of a better phrase, the brilliant Sir Vince Cable, who is former business secretary. Thank you for coming and joining me in the studio. Now, as former business secretary, let's get down to business and talk about business, which is, during my show last night, it turned out that Sir Keir Starmer has U-turned on the day one workers' rights bill and has reframed it essentially as all of these privileges or all of these rights come into play after 6 months. And there has been a bit of a backlash from the Labour Party backbenchers because, of course, this was a manifesto pledge. But do you think, had it gone through, they say that, well, it wouldn't have passed through the Lords. Do you think, had it gone through, and if workers were able to sue for unfair dismissal on day one or get paternity leave or sick leave, whatever it may be, that that would have been a burden that could be shouldered by businesses in Britain?
No, I think it would have been a problem. I mean, I was actually the minister who brought in legislation to extend the unfair dismissal time period from 1 year to 2 years, and they're now reversing that. So it's difficult striking a balance here. I mean, there are some exploitative employers, we all know that, but the more the difficulty you put in the way of good employers who hire unsuitable people and then can't move on, the more difficult it is to hire. And, you know, potentially with the combination of the minimum wage and the national insurance, there is a real risk that a generation of young people are going to find it very difficult to get into the labour market. So I think the balance had to shift, and I think the government's right to have done a U-turn on this. And it's easy to, you know, do popular rhetoric around workers' rights, but I mean, I had to deal with the issue of 0 hours contract, for example, which is another contentious issue. And it was clear that some people were being abused, but when we looked into it, we found there were very large numbers of young people, single parents, students, elderly people who wanted to continue working, who benefited from having flexible labour arrangements. So we decided to back off banning it. We excluded the more extreme prejudicial measures, but we refused to ban it. So I think you've got to be careful to get the right balance, and I think the government's right to have retreated from its, you know, quite advanced position on labour rights.
Do you believe then that this government's really sort of dealing, by and large, I mean, yes, they have had a U-turn, another U-turn, but a lot of their politics seems to be hinged upon ideology that when it comes into contact with the real world just doesn't stand up to rationality?
Well, I don't think the labour rights issue is an ideological question. It's a question of power. You know, who has the final call? Is it employers or is it organised labour? And you know, there's a role for both. I mean, when I was in government, I reduced some labour rights but upheld others. And I think what had happened, they'd made a very strong commitment through Angela Rayner to put through a big package of measures that the trade unions liked, but it's not just employers that have pushed back, but, you know, my party and the Tories in Parliament have said this is actually going in the wrong direction. It's going to, you know, prevent Britain recovering and employers doing more to grow and invest. So we've got to shift the balance back the other way.
Let's talk about the budget. What did you make of the approach of Rachel Reeves? Because it is my understanding that essentially the government had been told you've got to sort out the bloated welfare state. It is unsustainable. And we've got to get growth in the economy. And it seems to me that she's sort of, well, in terms of bailing out the debt to GDP ratio, it's been a sort of thimble here and there, that she's going to come back for more, that I cannot see any sort of green shoots of hope with her particular agenda. And instead of actually tackling the bloated welfare state, if anything, she's added more to it. Do you think that's a fair summary?
Well, actually, I would have defended getting rid of the 2-child limit because it was hitting a lot of low-paid workers in work. 70% of the people were actually in work, and you know there were, you know, families on low pay, one parent staying at home looking after children, and it's causing a lot of child poverty. But your general point is right, that we have a rapidly growing welfare bill. The problem is people like me, actually. It's there's a growing percentage of the national accounts which are having to be spent on elderly people, you know, with the triple lock pension, with the growing health bill. And if we're wanting to deal with, you know, the welfare budget, somebody's got to tackle that and make tough decisions about the triple lock, for example.
What about, we had migration statistics out yesterday, and when you drill down into them, some of the figures are quite startling. We've had 383,000 people come over to the United Kingdom from non-EU countries. Only 14% of them are working. These are either students, dependents. We also know that asylum seekers have accounted for half of net migration. Do you think that we're now in a situation where even people on the left can look at what's going on and say, this is uncontrollable, this is going to lead to huge problems societally if we go down this road even further?
I'm just absolutely baffled that people are now complaining about the fall in net migration. I mean, when it was high, there was far more people coming in than leaving. People said this is absolutely terrible, pressure on public services, how are we going to cope with it, pressure on house prices, rent. Once it comes down, I would have thought that all those problems diminish, but people complain and say now there's a brain drain.
It's the problem that the idea of net migration itself is a bit, it obscures the reality of the situation, because we know that what's happening is a vast number, an unprecedented number of young working Brits are leaving, 18 to 35-year-olds. We're talking about 110,000 of them who have left the country. And as I said, those who have come in, 383,000 of them from non-EU countries, only 14% of whom work. So we're losing essentially potentially our future workforce. We're having a brain drain, these people deciding they don't want to be here anymore, and replacing them with people who the state is going to have to support. And also we need to talk about potentially what that looks like in our communities, how that impacts social integration, the perception of the ordinary man and woman as to whether or not this is fair.
Well, I don't think your characterisation is right, actually. I think a lot of the people who've been leaving have been EU citizens who were made to feel they weren't welcome after Brexit. They've gone back home. Wages in Poland are probably now higher than they are in the UK, so why stay? And that accounts for quite a lot of the emigration. And if you're talking about the immigration, a large percentage of that, as you mentioned, are students. But actually, overseas students make a major contribution to the British economy. A handful stay behind, many of them because they're graduating into postgraduate jobs, because they're highly valuable in the science community and so on, but the vast majority return anyway. So the fact that a lot of them are students is neither here nor there. There is a very specific problem with the asylum system, as we all know, but that hasn't changed because of these numbers. It is the small boat problem. And, we know that it's very difficult to tackle because we don't have the legal instruments to do that.
So people out there who are listening to the news, who are looking at these figures, who may be living in a particular town or city where they feel like their neighbourhood has drastically changed and are saying, my goodness, we are doing something to this country that I didn't anticipate happening, that they've got no reason to worry, that we're not radically changing the face and the look and feel of Britain.
Well, I'm a bit longer in the tooth than you are.
Indeed you are.
I remember the arguments in the 1960s when we had Enoch Powell. As it happens, I had a mixed marriage. My late wife was Indian, and so we were very conscious of people saying exactly what you're now saying, and that was half a century ago. So this whole argument about changing Britain, reflects the fact that Britain has now become a much more mixed country. I mean, like all developed countries, actually, the overseas-born, the non-white population, if you put it in those terms, is actually as a proportion of the population not fundamentally different in the UK from any other developed country. And I think we're just going to get used to the fact that the world is a more open place, and we should welcome people who've got good skills.
You don't worry that people aren't getting used to it, because there's definitely, you can see across the whole of the Western world with the changes in political polling, populist parties, this audience messaging me, calling me, they don't want to have to get used to this. That's the problem with all of this. The ordinary Brit out there doesn't want to see their neighbourhood radically change. They're not comfortable with it. Whether that might make them in the eyes of some racist or far right, some might say that that's a sort of natural inclination of the human condition. And so are we not sort of embarking upon a kind of perilous social experiment?
No, it isn't a social experiment, but it is social change. I mean, I was in the West Midlands a couple of days ago, and I was at a very mixed school, utterly brilliant, people actually working together, good leadership, very high education standards, but outside in the street there were, not Union Jacks but St George's flags from people making the kind of point that you're making. But No, I don't see any problem with having a large majority of people who've come from overseas, providing they're young, they contribute to the labour force, they contribute to the country.
What about those people that do? What about the fact that we know that there are plenty of voters out there who do have a problem with this change, and we can't ignore that. We can't just say, well, you're going to have to lump it, because we are beginning to see people, like you said, protest peacefully, perhaps by putting up the national flag. But at what point do we reach a tipping point?
Actually,
we don't address those
hostility
issues.
has actually declined over the years very substantially. I mean, I saw this in personal terms. My dad would probably have been a Reform Party voter. He was, the old kind of right-wing working class kind of attitudes. He hated the idea I was marrying somebody of Indian origin, but actually 4 or 5 years later he accepted it, welcomed his daughter-in-law. We had a very happy set of relationships. And if you look at the polling, there's been an upsurge in concern about immigration, but actually over a 50-year period, the number of people who are hostile and who are worried about the kind of concerns that you're expressing has actually fairly steadily declined over time.
Even though Reform are leading in the polls?
Well, that's meaningless, right? I mean, the Lib Dems have been leading in the poll between elections at times past. I got into politics, we were almost 50% of the public, I think, back in 1983 when I first stood for Parliament. These things are meaningless. You've got a surge of populist right-wing views from Nigel and his team, and you've got Mr. Polyansky and the Greens, a surge of populists on the left. But that, when it comes to an election, I suspect the outcomes will be very different.
Thank you so much for coming in and talking to me. Sir Vince Cable, former business secretary.